Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me on the channel today. First of all, I just want to say thank you to everyone because I realized that we passed 30,000 subscribers for the channel. And that is such an honor for me that you would spend your time with me on our JFK channel. And I just can't tell you how appreciative I am of you, and especially thank you for all of those of you who take the time to write comments and help me understand more about the JFK assassination as I go along with my research also. Well, today I want to talk about James Files. Um, I know James Files is a hot button issue character in that a lot of people do believe his story, as was recorded and is easily available on YouTube and I'm sure other places. Um, and I just want to remind you that I'm the messenger, okay? I am just the messenger here. But what I need to tell you is that, in my opinion at least, James Files is a total fraud. He is a very, very good storyteller. And he's very, very intelligent. And I'll give you some extra reasons for that and later in the video how I know how intelligent he is. But we have to really look at his story in detail and we have to analyze it in light of all the facts that we know about the JFK assassination. And I can tell you that I am 100% sure that James Files is a fraud. And I'm sure if he's watching this video now that he's probably enjoying a beer and laughing because of what he's gotten away with for so long. Let's begin by stepping back just for a moment and remembering the late 1970s, early 1980s. And there we had the Assassinations Review Board. We had other congressional committees that were looking into the murders of President Kennedy, of Robert Kennedy, and of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Well, who was the main liaison that was provided by the CIA in order to service those investigations? Well, it was a man that was actually brought out of retirement, and his name was George Joannides. And we found out, of course, later that Mr. Joannides really wasn't interested in any of the investigative bodies getting the actual materials that they needed. He was really his primary focus was making sure that they went down rabbit holes and got only the information that the CIA really wanted those bodies to have. Now, when we're looking at James Files and his story, we have to step back and have to ask ourselves, well, who does his story really help? Who does his story really assist? And when you look at it, look at what his story is. His story, and we'll go over all of this in detail in a little bit, but when we step back and look, we see that he says that there was an abort on, and that all of the agencies, everybody that was involved in the JFK assassination on November 22nd, was going to abort. There wasn't going to be an assassination, but the mafia decided, and their exact words were, "Eff it, we're going to go ahead and proceed." So they were going to just on their own kill President Kennedy in Dallas. Well, does that make sense? Of course, it doesn't make sense. But who does it absolve of guilt in this case? It absolves the CIA, it absolves any intelligence agents that were around because it gives them an easy out. No, we were going to abort, even if it ever came that down to their admission of guilt of a few rogue elements. If you believe James Files' story, they never went through with it, and it was simply the mafia that committed the murder. Well, that's ridiculous. That's absolutely ridiculous. And I think we need to step back and look at that as the number one kind of basis as we move forward with James Files' specific story. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time on James Files' military background because we don't have a lot of information on it, but we have to look at the basics. James Files was born in 1942, January of 42. He says he went into the service in January of 59, which means he would have gone in right as he turned 17 years old. Now, the interesting thing is that he says he went to Laos in July of 1959, which means he would have only been in the service for 6 months. Yet he says he went to Laos as a special operations trainer for small weapons to the Laotian army. Um, and also as an instructor in demolition and how to set small explosive traps, that kind of thing. Well, where did he learn all that and how did he learn it so quickly? Are you kidding me? He went into the airborne, which means he had to learn to parachute, of course. So how did he do all that from January to July? It doesn't make much sense. Now, there are no records that I know of that exist of Files' military service except what he tells us. And again, that just gives us a little bit more reason to question what we're going to hear from him as we go on. He also says that he was court-martialed. But he doesn't spend a lot of time on why he was court-martialed. He says it's something that he doesn't want to talk about. So again, it's just really, really iffy. But we have to start with that as a basis because if we're looking at it in chronological order. Next, okay, so when he gets back, okay, well, all of a sudden, how did he get into the mafia? How did he get associated with mafia figures in Chicago? Well, he says he grew up in Chicago, so okay. He says he was racing stock cars when Charles Nicoletti, who he called a local hitman, the best of the local hitmen, but a local hitman, very, very underwhelming description of who Charles Nicoletti was. But he says that Nicoletti saw him driving, was impressed, and talked to him about being his driver. All right, so you can kind of understand where that might be true. All right, so we can kind of accept that. He does know a lot about people in the Chicago outfit, although I don't think he has it right about Accardo still being in charge of the Chicago Mafia. I believe it was Giancana at the time that he says Accardo was still in charge. That being aside, let's say that he was the driver for Charles Nicoletti. All right, so what about this Kennedy thing? How does this happen? Well, he says that he was in a bar playing pinball, and Charles Nicoletti walked in, told him to come outside to get away, and he tells him just that quickly that they've decided to hit President Kennedy. He's telling there's Charles Nicoletti, of course, is high in the Chicago Mafia, working under Sam Giancana. They have at their disposal everyone who are made men in the Chicago outfit. Plus, if you were going to do something like assassinate the president of the United States, you would have access to every mafia asset, in the country, because that would be something that would be agreed on at the very highest level. But Files tells us that Nicoletti took him out of the bar where he was playing pinball and said, "We're going to hit John Kennedy, and I want you to start looking at places that we might be able to do it in Chicago." Okay. Well, it's interesting that the Chicago plot story had come out not that long before, really got popular, before Files gives us this information. But anyway, he says this is about 6 months before the Chicago plot took place on November 2nd, 1963. But they decided not to go a lot forward with it because they didn't want Kennedy being killed in the Chicago Mafia's backyard. Again, well, the plot did go through. The plot did go through on November 2nd of 1963. When did it go through? It went through exactly the same day that the Diem brothers overthrow in South Vietnam happened. It was clearly a CIA operation in conjunction with the Secret Service, who bottled up all that information about the Chicago plot to make sure it didn't get out until Kennedy was killed in Dallas 3 weeks later. But the point of this is that Files' story in that aspect of the Chicago plot, he gives no details at all, and it makes really no sense. It's something that he heard of, that the Chicago plot had happened, so he wants to somehow reference it. This was in my opinion. He wanted to somehow reference himself, that he was aware of it. Okay, so now let's move to Dallas. It's a few months later, and Files tells us that the decision has been made to kill President Kennedy in Dallas. So, who does Charles Nicoletti send down to Dallas to check out the situation? Well, it's James Files. Well, again, let's think about that for a second. You've got all of the assets of the mafia really in the United States. You got Carlos Marcello, who's in New Orleans, who's clearly involved with David Ferry, and Jack Ruby, who's doing gun running to Cuba. You've got all of these high-end assets. But who does the Chicago mob send down to check out and really be their liaison in Dallas getting ready for the assassination? None other than James Files. Well, okay. So James Files says that he went down to Dallas. He's in Mesquite, Texas. It's on the Monday before the assassination, which will take place on Friday. And who knocks on his door? Why, it's none other than Lee Oswald. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? And Files says that he already knew Lee Oswald from 1961 when they were in New Orleans and Clinton, Louisiana, when they were delivering some submachine guns. Well, that's interesting because Lee Oswald was still in Minsk, Russia in 1961, and we wouldn't return to the United States for a full year later. So Lee Oswald knocks on his door, even though Files says no one is supposed to know he's in Dallas. So how does Lee Oswald know he's there? Well, Files says it must be because both he and Lee Oswald are being controlled by David Atlee Phillips. And it was David Atlee Phillips that Files says recruited him, to be an asset for the CIA. Well, that's about as ridiculous as it gets. David Atlee Phillips had nothing to do with recruiting. He would have had no contact with James Files. So this is just a way that Files can kind of, try to put a coherent story together. But anyway, so he says now that, Lee Oswald says, "Yeah, I've been assigned to kind of help you out and spend the time with you and, see what I can do too." And so he says, Files says that, for the next week, well, between Monday and Thursday, that they spend at least 5 or 6 hours together every day. They go out to a shooting range where Files will zero in all of the weapons, that calibrate all the weapons that may be used in the assassination, and that Lee Oswald is picking up the shells as to not leave any shells behind. He gets pretty detailed with all this. Well, the problem is that Lee Oswald is working at the Texas School Book Depository every day, and it's not the type of job where you can just leave for 5 or 6 hours and come in, when you want to, right? Okay, so when this is finally brought up to Files after he's already made this, you can kind of see the wheels turning in his brain, because he realizes this is catastrophic mistake. So he says right away, "Well, yeah, what I would do is, after we get done every day, I'd drop him, Lee Oswald, off in the vicinity down in Dallas. I didn't know where he was going, but he must have been going back to the school depository." Well, that is about as big a red flag as you can get, right? So, all right, let's move on, okay? So now it's the day of the assassination. It's Friday morning, and all of a sudden, James Files says that he was told to call the Cabana Motel in Dallas. He ends up hooking up with John Rosselli, who he takes to Fort Worth. And in Fort Worth, they go to a pancake house, and Roselli meets with Jack Ruby, who hands him an envelope and then leaves. Okay, so on the way back, Roselli opens up the envelope, and it's some identification. I'm assuming he's talking about Secret Service identification because he knows in his story he's going to need that at some point. But he really then says, "Oh, there was a map in there," and he references very, very clearly, "Oh, there's only one change. They're going to go down Houston Street and make a left on Elm Street." Well, that is so wacky because on Monday of that week, it was in both of the major Dallas newspapers the exact route, and that the route would include going on Houston Street and then making the left on Elm. So that part of it doesn't make any sense. Okay. And do you really believe that they would wait until the day of the of the assassination before really analyzing and discussing what the actual route would be? It's crazy. All right, but he says he goes back to with Roselli, and they go back, and by this time they're walking around Dealey Plaza, and it's about 10:30, and Kennedy's motorcade is really scheduled for about noon. It's a little bit late, so it doesn't get there until about 12:29 when the shots rang out. But this is about an hour before the assassination is supposed to take place, and Roselli and Nicoletti and Files are all in Dallas, and Files is told that, "Hey, listen, this is it's an abort. It's an abort, but we're going to go through with the mafia. We just said, F it, that's it. We're going to do it." Where would you look at, and where would you set up, James, if you were going to take a shot? This is an hour and a half before the motorcade is supposed to be in Dealey Plaza. Files tells us that they're asking him where they should set up for the shots. All right. So, and then of course he says, "Well, I'd go up on that knoll area there." He even calls it the Grassy Knoll, which it wasn't called at that point. Okay, but anyway, and he says, and Nicoletti says, "Well, where should I be?" And Files says, "Well, the Dow Tex building would be a great location." Files says he's never been in the Dow Tex building, right? In that week that he was in Dallas, he makes that very clear. But he suggests the Dow Tex building to Nicoletti. Well, are you what? Because, and the reason I say that is because you can't just go into a building and not know what office you're going to go to, right? You have to know what window you can open, how to shoot, what the trajectory is going to be, all of that kind of stuff, which would have had to have been done, weeks ahead of time at least. But Files says no. He suggested that to Charles Nicoletti. And then I think he realizes the danger of what he just said there, because what does he do? He says that, "Oh, Jim Braden was in town because he knew somebody in the Dow Tex building and that he could get access to." Well, he just kind of throws that in at the end, right? Because I think he realizes that he made a big time mistake there. Well, why would all the assets of the CIA, of the FBI, if you believe they were involved, the mafia, why would they need somebody from California, Jim Braden, who was, using that as an alias, Jim Braden? Why would they need him to come in to make contact with the Daltex building? He knows that Braden was arrested in the Daltex building, so it's a pretense for placing him there. Okay, so let's pick it up from there. we have Charles Nicoletti, who's moving towards the Dow Tex building, and James Files, who's heading to the Grassy Knoll area. There's still about 20 to 30 minutes left before the assassination, before the motorcade will come through at this point. So what does James Files do? He says that he's surveying the area. He's walking back and forth between the parking lot and then back up to the stockade fence. He's looking through, looking around, making sure no one's in the area that would be a potential threat to him. So he does eventually say that he saw two men in suits that were in front of the stockade fence that were off to the side that he wasn't very worried about at all. He could tell that they weren't carrying guns, he says at that point, but he doesn't see anyone else. There's no mention of a Ed Hoffman. There's no mention of a Gordon Arnold. There's no mention of anyone behind the fence besides himself. It's totally clear. Okay, so he forgets. Well, I don't know if he forgets, but he kind of just throws away the idea that Lee Bowers is in the railroad tower, 12 to 14 feet above the railroad yards, and has a exquisite view of the railroad yards, of the parking lot, and a pretty good view of the back end of the Grassy Knoll area. And we know from Lee Bowers' story, Lee Bowers is one of the most reputable, wonderful people that you could ever, have as a witness, in my opinion. Lee Bowers states very clearly that three cars drove through that parking lot behind the Grassy Knoll in the 20 minutes or so before the assassination, as if they were surveying the area. And the second car clearly had a driver who was on a walkie-talkie as he drove through, talking to whoever, as he made his survey of the area of the parking lot behind the Grassy Knoll. Now, if Files had been walking back and forth between the parking lot and the Grassy Knoll, he would have certainly noticed those cars, and Lee Bowers would have certainly noticed Files walking back and forth. Neither of those things happened, which again really throws very, very heavy shade on what Files is trying to get us to believe here, right? All right, so Files then says that from the time the limousine makes the left on Elm Street, he pretty much has it in his sights on the Remington fireball weapon that he has in his hands. He waits, he sees that President Kennedy has been hit, but there is no headshot, and he makes the determination to take that final headshot after the limousine gets past the Stemmons Freeway sign, and before the time where he would risk hitting anyone else in the car. He takes the shot, the fatal headshot on President Kennedy. What happens then? Well, he says that he put the weapon away, the Remington fireball, in the oversized briefcase that he has. He turned his jacket inside out, and then he took the time to bite down on a shell and leave that shell there. He also says that he noticed a motorcycle. And again, this is kind of, in my opinion, this is kind of thrown in because at this point, we know that the whole story with the Secret Service stopping people from going into the parking lot behind the Grassy Knoll, that has been relayed by Officers Seymour Weitzman, by Officers Roger Craig, and others. We know that those fake Secret Service agents were in the behind the Grassy Knoll and also in the vicinity of the Texas School Book Depository. So I think that, by the time Files is telling his story in 92 originally, he has to include them somehow. So he says that the two men in front, not behind, but in front of the stockade fence that I mentioned earlier, that he had noticed all of a sudden kind of stop the first officer, I think it was Officer Hargis, from the motorcycle when he was riding up there. Well, that took place, if you listen to the Roger Craigs and the Seymour Weitzmans, they were stopped behind the stockade fence as they tried to move to the parking lot. And so that part of the story doesn't make sense either, but I think it's something that Files knew that he had to throw in, because at that point it was known that there were fake Secret Service agents in the area. So, from that point, he says that he walked towards the parking lot by the Deltex building, and when he got to the car, Roselli and Nicoletti were already in there. He took them a few blocks to a gas station where he let them out, and they had another vehicle waiting, and then he took off. There's so much more that we could talk about James Files and his story and the inconsistencies that are really, really evident in his tall tale that he tells about killing John F. Kennedy. But let's think about this. After he goes back to Chicago, if he really had been the assassin that pulled the trigger in the fatal headshot of John Kennedy, he certainly would have been taken care of differently by the Mafia in Chicago, or he would have been killed, right? As they certainly wouldn't have wanted someone, especially at that young age, 20 or 21, going around able to tell the story later. But no, he's a guy that gets in a lot of trouble. He comes up with some fantastic tales about people trying to kill him, and then he ends up going to jail for the attempted murder of a police officer. The real clinching aspect of this story is what Edward J. Epstein, a really excellent researcher, found out when he was hired as a consultant to NBC when they were going to do a story on James Files. He hired an agency called the Kroll Agency. They all found out that James Files was not even in Dallas during the assassination of President Kennedy. He was in Chicago. When Epstein confronted Files with this story, you can just see the panic that occurred in Files's body at that point, because what he says is that he had a twin brother that he didn't know about, but until very recently. But his twin brother was the person actually with his wife in Chicago while she was giving birth to their child, and then he had to kill his twin brother later. I kid you not. That is the actual story that he told Edward J. Epstein. So that's just icing on the cake. Look, this is a guy who really, whether he was a disinformation agent who knew what he was doing and set up by Zach Shelton, or whether he just was a guy that came up with this story and attracted a lot of people who really ended up believing him, it really doesn't matter. James Files, is a fraud, and it's really obvious. He did not kill President John F. Kennedy. Thank you so much for being with me today. And again, thank you to the 30,000 subscribers that we have on the channel. I'll see you next time.